Welcome to Soul and Tonic. My name is Stephen Green, and today I am joined by my dear friend Ryan Cochran. How are you
Hello,
doing,
y'all.
Ryan?
I'm doing pretty good. Um, Trying to enjoy this lovely snowy weather that we have here.
I don't like snow. I like it for one day, but then after that, I'm done.
Yeah, I'm
It,
on day 2 now, so I guess I'm past it too.
it, it gets gross, and I hate ice. And yeah, no, I'm not good with it. I don't like
Yeah,
it.
I always get excited when it's coming down, and you open the window for the first time and you see it, and you're like,
Yeah.
"It's snowing!" And then like, okay, I'm over it.
You know the initial snow where it's like you got these big giant clops of snow coming down and you're like,
Yeah,
oh, it's novel, it's new, hey, I haven't seen this in so long. The nostalgia, the I remember as a child. And then you're like, oh wait, now I remember as a child why I hate it. When you slip, you fall, and you're like, I'm done.
yeah,
Yeah, so the snow's good for a day, and then I'm done. So well, today we are stepping back into the past a little bit to discuss a debate that took place back in October concerning our beloved election. The debate that we are going to be discussing is a debate between David French, who is a conservative author, editor. He is one of the founding members of the Dispatch, which is a conservative newspaper that is definitely worth looking into. Very fascinating individual, a lawyer, strong background. With his opponent in the debate being Eric Metaxas, a very well recognized conservative Christian author and radio host. I think his probably most popular piece would be Bonhoeffer. I
yeah.
remember it when I was doing my undergrad. That's when the book came out, and it just blew up. All of my professors like, you have to read Bonhoeffer. It's a must read. And so this is a little bit of a debate concerning the evangelical approach to the election and whether you should or should not vote for Trump. Being Eric Metaxas on the side of the affirmative and David French on the opposed side. So I found this entire debate interesting, especially now in light of everything that's happened since October, because my gosh, we've had a doozy of a couple months. Uh, so Ryan, why don't you just kind of start us off giving some of your thoughts? How did because you're the one that sent this to me. How did you find
Yeah.
this debate?
Yeah, so just a little background as to what kind of led us to this debate is Steve and I have both been listening or watching a lot of Holy Post just recently. We kind of just stumbled upon it, I think. And what I found interesting about their perspective is that they have the historical knowledge, know how to kind of explain how we got to where we're at with evangelicalism and the fundamentalist kind of movement within it. And I think for me, I've known for many years now how fundamentalist kind of perspectives have really become a part of the evangelical culture, but I didn't know how it happened, um, like the why behind it. And I feel like that historical perspective has kind of really enlightened that for me. Um, and there's part of it that's like we talk about fundamentalism when we're talking about theology and stuff, or even just politics in general,
Mm,
from both perspectives of Republican, Democrat, liberal, conservative. That you can be fundamentalist on either side, and what we usually mean by that is you're very rigid. It's your way or the highway kind of perspective.
yeah,
Um, but getting a historical perspective of what that really is and where it comes from, from an evangelical perspective, has really helped me define it more as to this was an actual movement. This was a faith perspective, essentially, that where
Hmm.
people would self-identify as fundamentalist, um, and that was, probably one of two primary kinds of ways of thinking of Christian culture in America. And so, what we had is kind of this battle between the what now we call like mainline um, Christians and the fundamentalist Christians. So we didn't have a third perspective, and then all of a sudden we have this rise of neo evangelicalism, which we just shortened to evangelicalism, and I didn't really understand that. So giving that historical perspective and kind of broadened my understanding of where we come from as evangelicals, and then how we get to be so fundamentalistic, because those two lines, they basically separated from one another to create
Hmm.
evangelicalism, but then they converged back on one another. And so basically fundamentalism has entered evangelicalism because the evangelical name and term was more popular, and has kind of just subverted it from within, converted it into basically fundamentalism.
Hmm.
So the evangelical culture we have today is not evangelical. Um, and so what we're seeing, I think, is more people starting to realize this and come to knowledge of this. And now I think evangelicalism is starting to split. As more people become aware of this, they're realizing, wait, we're not the same. Just because you say you're evangelical and I'm evangelical doesn't mean we believe the same things.
Yep.
So I think this debate highlights that, and I stumbled upon it just through YouTube algorithms suggesting videos to you, um, but I think that came out of me watching a Holy Post video where David French was in it, right?
Mm.
And so I stumbled across this, watched it, and I was just stunned about how this is just represents all of that evangelical split that I think we're starting to see, um, and I think it's a good representation of that because they're both conservative. These are both people that would highly
Hmm.
um, self-identify as just Republican, right? Uh, so they're on the same side, and yet they're not. How is that? It's all about their perspective of what it means to be a Christian and a Republican at the same time. And yeah, so I think for me, this was something I wanted to bring to you because I feel like it could be one of the most important debates I've seen in a long time.
Yeah.
Um, so
Yeah. It really caught me off guard because if you watch the debate, which was hosted by John Brown University, the whole of it, you would not know that they were on the same side if you hadn't heard them say it. Like the way that they approach the same subject seems so vastly different that you begin to question, like, are they both really Republican conservatives? But they are.
or
They're
even both
very,
Christians.
yeah, yeah, well, yeah. They're both Christian evangelical conservative Republicans, and yet their approach to this is so vastly different. But even the way that they argue is vastly different. I think that is very telling. So, just to start, uh, if you're interested in watching the debate for yourself, you can find it on YouTube. It is currently on the Unbelievable channel, so it's like unbelievable. Uh, and if you're wanting to watch it, I strongly advise that you just skip to minute 10 to get past the initial introduction, because I found no benefit to that at all, other than explaining their backgrounds. But I think if you just Googled them and got their bios from there, you would be better off. Um, so, interestingly enough, they start this whole debate with David French giving his pitch for why you shouldn't vote for Trump. And some of the things that really stood out to me from his perspective was one of uh, discussing the continuity of the way that evangelicalism has voted over the last 20 years or 50 years. And he goes straight into it that, one of the first things that the SBC, the Southern Baptist Convention, did in response to the Clinton scandal back in the 90s was that they put out a statement saying very strongly, we wholly support that if you're our American leaders must be of good moral character, because a leader with bad moral character is quote unquote searing to the mind of the culture or something like that. And that really stood out to me. And then the reality that evangelicals went from being so adamant that you had to vote according to moral character to the modern polls saying that evangelicals are least likely to say that now is mind-blowing to me. It is somewhat horrifying to me. What were your thoughts concerning some of these elements with David French and him pointing out this kind of a hypocrisy or this kind of a two-faced approach to politics?
Yeah, I think there was actually an part of the FAQ that was really helpful for understanding this first part, where he kind of explains that even because the main argument against his point is, well, what about our Christian values? What about these things that evangelicals want to support or go against, like voting against abortion, right? And these like
Sure.
kind of main things you're going to think about when evangelicals look at a ballot. And the point is that you do not have to vote for somebody just because they're Republican or Democrat. In this case, with Trump, Republican. Just because of those issues, you also have to weigh in the characteristics of that person. And so the main argument is, well, do you have blood on your hands if you vote against Trump or not vote at all? And he basically says voting just with your conscience is one extremely valuable as a Christian, and two, there's value in not voting for somebody, not necessarily voting against them, but just not voting for them,
Mm-hmm.
because your vote is still a number that is used to gauge interest in that party member.
Yeah.
So when you have more votes for Republican senators than you do, say, for a Republican president in the same ballot, because people don't want to vote for that president or president-elect because of their character, then that's telling to the Republican Party. They can look at the numbers, see the difference, and say, we've missed the mark somehow, and they can adjust. So, but part of that, being able to look at the ballot that way and look at the characteristics of the persons that are running for that office, the mindset you got to have is one of Christianity and republicanism or democratism is not the same, no matter
Mm.
what perspective you have. So you have to vote for the change you want to see in that party. So if you are highly Republican, you think Republican's the way to go, then vote from a perspective of, I need to do what is necessary to change that party, not just vote in whoever's Republican or running as Republican, I should say.
Yeah,
Um,
it's an excellent point. I know a good number of Republicans. There are very strongly Republican, strongly conservative individuals who absolutely refuse to vote for Trump.
right.
I know this was something that was noted to be very true about the Mormon community, that Mormons in general are extremely conservative. However, by and large, they were not willing to vote for Trump because they saw his moral character and saw his attitude and the way that he approached things as being dangerous and unhelpful to society and to the Republican Party.
Yeah.
So I think that that's an excellent point about voting for the change that you want to see, because Trump wasn't the only one on the stage. There were multiple people upon that stage that they could have voted for 4 years ago. In fact, even just this past year, there were other Republican candidates that ended up not being talked about or debating. He refused to debate them. The Republican Party mostly put him aside. But there were other options there other than him. So I think it's interesting to see how this whole approach varies within the Christian community. And I know, like, for my family, they're very strongly supporters of Trump, while I myself am not. uh, though I, by and large, hold a lot of the same values that they do. Um, and I think like that says something about the different approach to the spiritual life as well, and how we approach this. So, um, yeah,
Yeah. Something else I just found interesting about David French's debate is that he very much treats it as a debate. He's using facts. He's using
yeah,
statistics. Um,
he applied strong use of logic. He
yes.
was making his points very clear. This and this, and I felt
Yeah.
like he didn't stray from that much at all. Like, he was very strongly like, there are very clear cut correlations here, and I did not find Eric Metaxas did the same. I was actually really
Yeah.
surprised because I know him to have be like a big time researcher, conservative radio host, an author. I mean, like I said before, Bonhoeffer, one of like the biggest outbreaks for literature for the evangelical movement. Just what, 10 years ago, and to listen to him talk about it, it was very charged, very heated, but it was loaded with gaslighting and straw man arguments. Uh, he couldn't refer to the left without saying something like uh, cultural Marxists. And like, he was using really strong language to build your emotions against them, but didn't really seem to give us support for what he was saying. Now, what did you think about that? Was that your opinion on that as well, or do you think that I'm off base on that?
For the most part, I have to agree that he did not use same kind of statistics that would drive a debate like David French did. Um, he mainly just leaned on just rhetoric,
Hmm.
and it made him to sound like another politician, just griping
Yeah.
about liberal values, and which is interesting, right? Because this is not a debate between a liberal and a conservative, is it? It's a debate between two conservatives.
Yeah.
But it's part of that whole um, that fundamentalist perspective of anybody outside of my understanding of the world is the enemy, and
Mhm.
they have to be totally off base and not even within my own kind of tribe. So, which is part of that whole kind of cancel culture in a way, but
Hmm.
I would like to say just like that new kind of American culture, if we just can't disagree without hating one another and thinking we're the enemy, and but unfortunately I feel like my point in talking about this video is that is now evangelical.
Mhm.
That is fundamentalist perspective, sure, but now that's identified, labeled as evangelical, and it is what you are seeing in the news. So now our whole country is identifying evangelical as fundamentalism, both within the theological Christian church sphere, but also within politics.
Mhm.
And those two now are not differentiated from one another. They're one and the same.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I had a conversation with an Orthodox priest friend of mine the other day, and we were having this discussion about the fundamentalism versus evangelicalism. And out of my natural curiosity, I turned to Merriam-Webster. I was like, "Well, what is exactly the definition of fundamentalism?" And Merriam-Webster puts it as a very harsh, strict, literalistic perspective of Scripture.
Sure.
And I think what is developed into, at least our understanding of fundamentalism, is what you were saying, is that rigid, like my way or the highway kind of perspective of like, I'm the one that's right and no one else is right, and therefore they are my enemy. Um, they're a threat to me because they're like, if they try and change my mind, they're threatening they're threatening the truth. They're
Yeah.
attacking the truth. And there seems to be a very closed-minded approach to the world that uh, not that long ago I was in that world. I understand where they're
Yeah.
coming from. I understand
Yeah.
why they're doing it, and so like I don't want to say all that to just sound hateful and rude, because I understand. I've been the fundamentalist,
Right.
and thankfully I've been able to walk away from that. But what seems fascinating to me is that you were talking about evangelicalism, how it was a separate movement, but now it's kind of turned back into being fundamentalism. A lot of evangelicals, it's very like simplified, very strict rulings, very much what the Puritans' goals were back
Yeah.
in the day. Simplify the theology, simplify the logic, the worship, the culture, and bring it down to it's just scripture, it's the Bible, it's the literalistic interpretation. So how did we, in your opinion, move back into fundamentalism? Why does fundamentalism call to people so well? Why does it impact people so well?
Oh man. So if I were to give a simple solution, a simple answer, I guess, right now, I would actually be probably leaning into the fundamentalism perspective,
Hmm.
because that is a big part of one of the pieces. I should say, not a big part. Let me see. I'm already trying to go that direction. Gotta check myself. It's a piece of what made it is what it is today. Um, the simple answer, the simple solution, is what gives people the sense of security that they need.
Mm.
That is their salvation, their God, rather than God Himself. Um, when you give simple solutions, it helps feel like the complicated world around them is manageable. Um, it makes them feel
Yeah.
like they're not spinning out of control anymore. That they can. Man, you can take this a lot of ways. It could be that now they can feel like they can pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, which we know that mentality is pretty prolific. Uh, yeah, it can just give them a perspective of no matter what, I'm blessed and
Yeah.
I'm going to be blessed. Kind of that prosperity gospel kind of creeps in.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it can just help them feel like that no matter what's going on in the world, um, there's just a solution where they can be a big part of the solution. So they're a part of the blessing. They're they're special in some way. I feel like for me in my past, I think of it this way, like the example of youth groups and how and I'm just as much guilty of this in my past as anybody else, but telling young people that they are special, that they have this special, unique place in culture in our history, and that they're gonna make a change in the world like none other, and
You're
you
the
really,
future.
yeah, you really spin this positive perspective, but you give nothing to actually make that happen, and
Mm.
you you again, it's all oversimplifying the world. Um, and so when you get out into the world, you do have dissonance, some cognitive dissonance of how reality is actually going for you and what you thought it was going to do. What it was going to be like.
Yeah.
Um, and in all these situations, there's going to be cognitive dissonance whenever the complicated world really confronts your simplified solution and kind of laughs at it,
Yeah.
because ultimately those simple solutions either don't do anything at all or they make things worse
Mm-hmm.
with unintended consequences. And I think Trump is one of those simplified solutions of with chock full of unintended consequences. Um, so yeah,
Yeah.
did that answer the question? I feel like I may have.
No, I think you did answer my question, just in terms of like, I understand the desire for simplicity.
Yeah,
I want things to be like easy to unravel, easy to figure out. Trying to pour through a manual or a handbook is not something I enjoy. And I can relate to that. Like, you want something that is manageable and understandable, that is easy to navigate. Um, I think that feeling of control, that need for control, is deeply and somewhat uh, illogically tied to security and safety. Uh, so one of the things that David French pointed out was the security of religious liberty, because the thing that keeps coming out and being talked about is, if Trump loses, you have a loss of religious liberty. Even Eric Metaxas is like, you're not going to be able to have forums like this. You're not going to be able to talk about stuff. Like, why?
yeah,
Why would you not be able to? We've been having these conversations for long time.
hundreds of years now.
Yeah, like they had this debate back in the height of, like, they would have debates and stuff back in the height of Christian persecution. Like, there's that's not the reality of it. Like,
Yeah,
back in the time when Paul was being arrested and getting thrown in jail and stuff, he was still going and having debates and forums on Mars Hill in Greece.
yeah,
And and the reality is that that's just not true. Um, there are a lot of people on uh, both sides that are Christian, and then there's a bunch that are not Christian. I think that with this in particular, there's some hyper fear mongering here. There's a lot of baseless statements. Like, the reality is that the Bidens are both, like, proudly declared Roman Catholic. Which I know, like, that unnerves a lot of evangelicals, but it's not that they're against religion. They're not against religious liberty. They are religious, and we have David French pointed this out, that with the Supreme Court, there is a 15 winning streak in favor of religious liberty. Um, but I'm beginning to think that some of these terms are being misused, because what it sounds to me is that the right is, with Trump in particular, isn't necessarily promising religious liberty. Um, and they get into this a little bit, is the religious power and the difference between the two,
Yes.
being in control. The fact is that a lot of what evangelicals or fundamentalists in particular seem to be pushing for in terms of politics is not religious liberty.
Right.
Um, it's not pushing for one's freedom of worship and freedom of belief. It is the opposite. They're saying they want religious liberty, but only if it's their version of it. If
Right.
it's the fundamentalist version of religious liberty, which means you have the ability to be a fundamentalist, and that's it. uh, which feels very opposed to the Constitution and to the American lifestyle and to Christianity itself, in my
Yeah.
opinion.
Yeah. It's definitely religious power masking itself as religious liberty, because ultimately what they're proposing is all the power goes to the evangelical, and anybody outside of that, their religious liberties are suppressed. If you're,
Mhm.
you know, coming into this country as a Muslim, no, your religious liberties are suppressed, um, and they're okay with that because it's about the power. Now, what's irony upon irony,
Mhm.
in which there's many in Metaxas's debate, is that he's saying it's all about the power for the Democrats. It's all about the power for Biden.
Yeah.
What do you think it's about for Trump? Um, what makes you think it's not about that for Trump? And he's not willing to give any arguments, any statistics, anything
Yeah.
to really push back on that. That's what's so surprising to me, is that uh, David French gives all these facts, all these reasons not to vote for Trump,
Hmm.
and Eric Metaxas just blows by him. He doesn't address them.
Yeah.
He thinks
Yeah. Not a single
he
one.
can win. Yeah, he thinks he can win this argument, this debate, all on rhetoric. And sure, that works
Yeah.
sometimes. In fact, I think one of the big debates we've seen in the past few years of Christian um, debates was Bill Nye versus um,
Ken
Ken.
Ham.
Yeah, and I think Bill Nye kind of won that debate based off of rhetoric, in a way, but
Yep.
not through his own means. It was through Ken Ham's just failure. Uh, Ken Ham was not a debater by
He
any
was
stretch of the
not
imagination.
there. Yeah.
Um,
You.
Eric Metaxas is a little bit. Uh, he's definitely more charismatic, at least.
Yeah.
But that's about it. Uh,
He approached this debate like a Tucker Carlson newsreel. That's how I felt. I was like, is this Eric Metaxas or is this Tucker
yeah,
Carlson? This they're coming for you. They're not gonna let you do this. They're not gonna let you that. They're baseless. There's no like nothing to support these claims. And in fact, with the only thing that he came even close to
yeah,
addressing was David French referring to Trump as having racist tendencies, making racist statements and racist claims. He's like, in my opinion, he's not a racist. And I wrote the book on Bonhoeffer. Well, what does that even mean? Like that
oh god,
like come on. That's not a response. That's not an argument. You can't say like that is not a retort whatsoever.
you know,
Which was really disappointing to me.
yeah, yeah, like he gave some historical perspective from his own perspective, I should say,
Hmm.
of what it means to be Republican as far as race and racism.
Yeah.
And it was full of half truths.
Yeah.
That's the best I could say about it. He has some points, but gosh, he's just again blowing by the counterpoints that he should know. Um, the historical perspective he's presenting is this half-baked truth,
Mm-hmm.
and he's expecting you to gobble it up because, again, all rhetoric. It's all about um, is republicanism Christianity, basically.
Yep.
And so, again, all from this perspective of what David French is liberal. Come on, David French is not liberal by any stretch of
No,
the imagination. So,
no, not at all.
so uh, for him to say Republicans are Christian and they're not racist because we signed or we did these things for the African American community of Americans when you know the Civil War happened and blah blah blah.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, yes, that's true, but what happened after that? Well, the Republic Party abandoned them. They
Yeah.
basically said, "Here you go, Democrats," or essentially, really, the South.
Mm-hmm.
You can do whatever you want. They no longer really had any kind of suppression of slavery outside of just that law that was standing there that they couldn't have slaves. So they legalized it. How? Through the prison system, just
Mm-hmm.
leasing out slaves, treating them worse than before. So if anything, it just made things worse.
Yep.
But um,
Because
it,
not everyone who was against slavery was uh, against racism. There were plenty of racists who opposed slavery because they simply did not want African Americans in the country at all. Um, I know, like, from what I understand, like the governor of Ohio at the time said that if any freed slaves tried to cross the borders into Ohio, he'd have them shot. Uh, but he was against, no, they were against slavery, but they were also against African Americans. Like,
yeah,
that's like awful.
and now my point is not that Democrats, therefore, are saints. My point is neither side is anti-racist.
Yeah.
They both have blood on their hands. They both have responsibility for the current situation of colored people, where they are economically suppressed and and suppressed in so many other ways, including geography, just
Redlining and
right, just where they can and can't live, and that's gone on for
Mhm.
decades past the Civil War, and that is due to lawmaking both on the Democrats and the Republican side. So
Yeah.
to say Republicans are the anti-slavery
Yeah.
Christian party is just baloney,
Yeah.
absolutely baloney. And to say that for Democrats too would be baloney. Unfortunately, that's just kind of where we're at with Republicans. I don't know so much with Democrats. I haven't really heard Democrats saying, "Oh, we're the Christian party, and we're anti, racism."
Hmm.
Um, but there's probably plenty of people that think that way.
Yeah.
So I just want to challenge both sides of this argument and say, look, um, whether you're pro Trump or not, you got to understand that the Republican Party or the Democratic Party um, is not concerned about your Christian values. They're just not. And to think that they are is just fooling yourself. It's finding that simple solution to make your world a little easier to understand.
Hmm.
It's only deceiving yourself, and you're making politics your religion, not your faith in God. And so, where we're at with this, watching this video, is kind of checking ourselves and wondering, like, well, what now? How how can we move on if there's really no good solution, if there's no good answer for voting for or against Trump, and therefore maybe in your mind for or against Biden. Well, I think David French is starting to give some solutions. He's him and the people around him are actually thinking about that very question. Eric Metaxas is not. He's still lost in the woods of republicanism.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and that's strongly reflected in some of his Twitter stuff as well, and some of his responses to even the Capitol insurrection. So it's been and the Jericho March, which he, from my understanding, helped and was a part of
Yep.
facilitating that.
Yep.
I am in no way, shape, or form loyal to the Democratic Party, but I'm also in no way, shape, or form loyal to the Republican Party because they're playing a game. They're playing this game that people are buying into. Uh, the Republican Party is notably able uh, to play the Christian card easier and more flippantly than the Democrats. Now, there are Democratic politicians who definitely play that card and make claims of being Christian or whatever, and sure, but they're no more or less Christian than the ones on the Republican side. Their approach is different, and
yeah, and to go back to your question of how do we get here, as far as fundamentalism kind of becoming evangelical, therefore republicanism. So another little piece of that puzzle that I want to highlight is just the historical context of that. So at some period in time, we had, the evangelical movement that was exploding, right?
mm-hmm.
And so they're one of the bigger voter bases, you could say, of America that just either side of the party could have picked up and ran with.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, you had the fundamentalists, which is mainly the South, that are essentially being abandoned by their Democratic Party, at least through the Democratic presidents that were being elected, passing different laws and stuff. And so this is another fairly large voter base that had been dwindling for a while because of the rise of evangelicalism, and because they didn't really engage with the culture. They were kind of like isolating themselves.
Yeah.
But here's also a big chunk that the Republican Party saw as just being disenfranchised by their Democratic Party, and just thought, well, how about we pick up both of those big chunks? We could, even though they're totally not related to each other, right? Let in fact, the fundamentalists straight up just said, evangelicalism is just like the worst. It's the most dangerous thing in our nation. Calling out Billy Graham, who was basically the head, the figurehead, I should say, of the evangelical movement, neo-evangelical movement, saying that he was the most dangerous thing to happen since forever. Like, he's the most dangerous thing to happen to the Christian faith in America. This is coming from, highly respected fundamentalist university president, or something like that. And so the Republicans are seeing both of these parties and going, what if we just kind of combine the two and bring them in to the Republican Party as our primary voter bases? It worked. I don't know how, but over time they just started saying both of them were evangelicals and just brought them in. And this is partially because the fundamentalists realized they were being disenfranchised by the Democrats.
Yeah.
Wanted to make a change to republicanism.
Yeah.
At the same time, the Republican Party is making decisions to reach out to the evangelicals. So it just all worked in the Republicans' favor, to where they could just grab both at the same time and make them hold hands.
Yeah.
It worked. Now nobody calls themselves a fundamentalist. Nobody self-identifies a fundamentalist. You don't have fundamentalist universities and colleges anymore. Now they're labeled as evangelical.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just the power of politics. How they can just totally manipulate the narrative and just make you believe something totally different from what is reality. Totally subvert your faith, your denomination. And the worst thing about it is, as those two combined, the fundamentalist values were just easier to take root within evangelicalism, whether it was churches or schools, it didn't matter. And so that's where we're at. We're basically, for the most part, a fundamentalist group that calls themselves evangelical, and therefore Republican. So again, just one little piece. There's lots of little pieces that kind of led up to that. But
I think that's an interesting point, where tying being a Christian and being Republican together as being almost synonymous, especially like when I grew up in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and the way that it was talked about is like, if you're a Democrat, then you're not a real Christian. You're not a true Christian. A true Christian would be a Republican. And I heard that growing up. I felt that. I believed that. It wasn't until later when I started really looking into it. I'm like, wait a minute, why did I believe this to begin with? And anyone that I go back and talk to now who has maintained that perspective can't give me a reason, not a good response as to why they've looked at Republicans as being the Christian party. It's just, that's what it is. And most of the time it's the argument of, I'm against abortion. And I hear that. I understand that. But I think what I'm also seeing with the Republican Party, especially what we're seeing now, especially with Trump, is this xenophobia that, Christianity specifically said, take care of the widow, the orphan, the stranger, the foreigner in your lands, treat them as your own. That is biblical approach to social interaction, to social policy, foreign policy, is treat the foreigner as a native, welcome them with open arms, take care of them, and show them. This is ancient Judaism. This is before Christianity. Judaism taught this, and then Christianity also taught this, that you embrace the foreigner as one of your own. And the prophecy that was given out by, I believe it was Isaiah, was that the new covenant that was going to be enacted, which is the covenant through Christ, is that the light of Judaism, the light of God in Israel, was going to be no longer bound to just the land of Israel and to the temple, but that it would go and spread throughout all nations. And now it's become this mindset, like, where we say these things in church, we talk about the whole world being brought to Christ and the whole world being evangelized, but at the same time keeping this arm's length, like grabbing someone by the collar but then holding them in place and saying, like, you must become a Christian, stay over there. and so even though, yeah, the Republican Party is going against abortion, what about the foreigner? What about the widow and the orphan? What about the poor person who is struggling and suffering? Um, we definitely have not seen that this past 4 years. We definitely didn't see it this last year when the both sides were arguing and debating about whether or not they should give out money to people or stimulus checks and stuff. And then after so much time of debating about a second, they debated a second stimulus check for 7 months, and then decided $600 was what they're just going to give everybody, uh, and just wholesale, just your help is coming. And this was insane that you had all these debating and arguing about whether or not they should help their people who they saw were suffering, who they saw were in need, um, all because they wanted to argue their agendas for all these other things that they were attaching to the bills and stuff. Neither side is for the people.
Right.
Neither side is for the people, and neither side is holding to strictly Christian values. The Democrats are doing things and pushing for things that are in fact extremely biblical and Christian, and arguably even more so than the Republican Party is doing. As much as I'm not wholesale for abortion, I have to say that saying that voting against abortion doesn't, in my mind, come across to me as the most Christian response to this argument. Because, again, the people who are alive that aren't hypothetical future kids are alive and suffering and need help. And instead of helping them, we are rejecting them. We're putting them into concentration camps on the border. We're doing all these things that are very much against Christianity, against biblical perspective and theology. And so for me, I find it mind-boggling that there's such a dual mind, such a disconnect with both of those things. Again, I understand why the abortion narrative is so strong. I understand why it stirs emotion. It's a call to action. Oh, they're murderers. We need to put it into it, instead of saying like, well, we're also going to mistreat the world, you know. And I think that's a huge hypocrisy. I think that's a huge disconnect.
Yeah, but I think as far as this debate goes, looking at two conservatives arguing with each other over pro or against Trump, what's interesting is how David French can address that very thing from the facts of what have we seen from Trump in the last 4 years, for the very case that he's leaning most into for the evangelical vote is the abortion. And just saying, look, Trump is not anti-abortion. If he was, then why would we see, shoot, now the name's gonna leave me on the spot, but Planned Parenthood receive more government funding than ever in their history in these last 4 years under Trump than ever any other time.
Yep.
It's all because of the way, we voted in somebody that we thought had the same values as us, but really just wants our vote. Just wants the power. It doesn't matter what your Christian values are to him. And so, but then Eric Metaxas on the other side of this argument lives in a fantasy world of still, even with that, going to argue that if you vote against Trump, there's blood on your hands. It's like, what? There's just a cognitive disconnect there. And the only way they can solve that is live in a fantasy world. Create a narrative within their own mind that just rewrites everything they're seeing. It just blocks out anything that doesn't agree with their worldview, and accepts without any kind of fact checking or anything, anything
Yep.
that is promoting their worldview. So I find this interesting because me growing up in a fundamentalist church, and
Mhm.
sorry BRCC, if you're anybody from there is watching this, you are fundamentalist, whether you like it or not. One of their core values that they're trying to teach the youth is critical thinking. Think critically about the sciences, about these different perspectives on abortion, pro and against, and really think through the repercussions of the answers and all that. Just think critically.
Mhm.
But to think critically would be to totally dismantle the very thing that they're standing upon. All these fantastical views of republicanism, essentially. Gosh, I mean, the fact that they live in a world where they think, gosh, okay, I need to back up. Now I'm starting to use the word they. Okay,
Yeah.
I don't want to do that. I don't want to throw people under the bus like that.
It's easy to do. It's
Yes,
really
it
easy
is.
to fall
It
into
is.
that.
And this is part of the struggle. This is the culture we live in, and because of that, it's trying to mold us into that kind of thinking. This is our struggle as Christians today, to negate that and say, I'm not gonna be part of that. But so here I am trying to represent that very thing. I want to say we shoot, what was I saying? We we live God, that totally threw me off track, but it's a point I need to make, right? That we do want to just say us versus them and be done with it. But let's say we as evangelicals that very much grew up in fundamentalism need to or feel like okay, I remember we feel like when our values are the way and the only way, and when they're so tied with republicanism, we feel like we have a free pass. We have a free pass to be bigots, to push people out, to tell people that their way of thinking is evil, all because we think we are the divine ones with the divine connection to the divine God that knows all.
Yep. It's kind of arrogant.
Oh, it's exactly that. What the irony of that, of believing in a God that knows all, is it's supposed to teach you that you don't.
Yep.
That you're not God. That you don't know all. And therefore have more empathy, more compassion for others. Eric Metaxas represents all of the fantasy and bigotry, I feel like, of that without even knowing it. He's so in a fantasy world, he's being a bigot on stage and is totally oblivious of it while he's defending a bigot.
Yeah.
It's not his defense of the bigot that makes him a bigot. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying this is the guy. Guys, are the first line from his debate is, "Jane, you ignorant slut."
Oh my God! The moment he said that, I had to pause and be like, "Was that really his first? Was that really the first thing that he said?"
I paused it too. At first, I sat there for a minute, listening, waiting for his follow-up to that. but there really wasn't one. I was shocked. I was like, this represents everything I see in Trumpism.
Yeah.
This is this would be the Christian kind of guy that would represent somebody that says grab him by the pussy.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
I mean,
if you enjoyed this conversation, would like to engage in this conversation, please feel free to send us questions, comments, leave a comment down below. Let us know your thoughts on this. Please try to, let's keep it cordial, keep it clean, and keep it kind. Like, subscribe, and Ryan, thank you so much for sharing this debate with me and with us, and sharing your thoughts on this.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Yeah. Until next time, this is Soul and Tonic. We'll see ya.